She was a millionaire's daughter, but one sip changed everything. The night was calm, the city lit like scattered stars. But inside a mansion that towered over the skyline, silence ruled heavier than gold. She was the daughter of one of the richest men in America, and yet her life was about to be rewritten by a single sip. The Harrington estate was a palace of glass and marble. Chandeliers glowed above velvet halls, fountains whispered in the gardens, and fleets of cars rested like jewels in the driveway. But among the riches there lived a silence too heavy to ignore. Her name was Elara Harrington, only daughter of Thomas Harrington, a man whose empire stretched across continents. To the world, Thomas was a visionary, a titan of wealth and power. But at home, he was a father haunted by something money could never cure: his daughter's silence. From birth, Elara had never spoken. Doctors called it selective mutism. Others believed it was something far deeper. Her mother had passed when Elara was only a toddler, leaving Thomas with both his grief and the weight of his child's condition. He tried every treatment, every specialist, every therapy. Some said patience would help. Others claimed her voice was locked by trauma. Yet no cure came. Elara grew in beauty, kindness, and grace. Her eyes were blue as ocean glass. Her golden hair fell like silk, and her laughter, though silent, shone in her gestures, in the way she clapped when birds flew or hugged the gardener when flowers bloomed. But her voice remained imprisoned. At galas, when reporters asked why his daughter never spoke, Thomas would smile tightly and say, "She's just shy." But inside, it shattered him. Each night he sat by her bed, whispering fairy tales, praying for a miracle, waiting for a word that never came. And so, despite the endless wealth around her, Elara's world was painted in silence, until the day fate poured something golden into her hands. Thomas Harrington was the kind of man people envied. Billionaire at 40, philanthropist featured on magazine covers. But when he was alone, stripped of applause and accolades, he was just a father kneeling at his daughter's bedside, wishing she would say, "Daddy." He remembered the day his wife, Caroline, passed away. A car accident, sudden and merciless. Elara was 3. That night, as Thomas held her trembling form, he swore he heard her trying to speak. A sound caught in her throat like a bird striking the bars of its cage. After that night, her silence deepened. Therapists filled their calendar. Specialists flew in from Switzerland, Japan, even Israel. Thomas spent fortunes on clinics, sound machines, speech programs. He turned entire wings of the mansion into therapy rooms. But every effort ended in disappointment. Some relatives whispered cruelly, "All that money and he can't even fix his child." Others pitied him. But none understood the torment. The empire builder who could bend markets and governments powerless before the stillness in his daughter's throat. Elara, however, didn't seem broken. She laughed with her eyes. She wrote in notebooks, drawing whole worlds with crayons and watercolors. She hugged strangers, gave her dolls tea parties, and carried a little journal where she scribbled dreams. But every time she pointed at her throat and shook her head, Thomas's heart cracked deeper. In the quiet of his study, Thomas sometimes prayed aloud, "God, take everything. The planes, the skyscrapers, the fortune. Just give her a voice." And though he didn't know it then, his prayer would be answered, not by doctors, not by wealth, but by something far simpler and far stranger. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. Thomas's black limousine glided through the heart of the city, weaving past traffic lights and towering billboards. Elara sat in the back seat, her small hands pressed against the tinted window, her eyes chasing the blur of people outside. Suddenly, her gaze locked onto something unusual. At the edge of the plaza, near a crumbling fountain, a girl darted between the crowd. She couldn't have been more than 13, a little older than Elara. Her clothes were torn, her shoes mismatched, her hair tangled with dirt. And yet she carried herself with a determination that defied her raggedness. Clutched in her hands was a small glass bottle. Inside shimmered a golden liquid, glowing faintly in the afternoon sun as though it carried the light of another world. She guarded it like treasure, pressing it close to her chest when strangers bumped into her. Elara leaned forward, pressing her forehead to the glass. Something about the girl, wild-eyed, fierce, fragile, pulled at her heart. She tapped the window, gesturing urgently to her father. Thomas barely glanced up from his phone. "Just street kids, Elara, don't look." But Elara didn't stop. She tugged the driver's sleeve when the car halted at a red light, her silent plea speaking louder than words. She wanted to step out, to follow, to understand. For reasons he couldn't explain, Thomas agreed. He waved to his driver. Let her stretch her legs. I'll be in that meeting for 20 minutes. Stay close. Elara stepped onto the square, the air alive with chatter and honking horns. Her eyes scanned for the girl. And then, by the fountain kneeling, the strange bottle glowing in her hand, there she was. Their worlds were about to collide. Her name was Mera. She was 14, though hardship had carved years into her young face. She had no home, no family except a frail grandmother who sold herbs and whispered tales of miracles. Mera had grown up in alleyways, her lullabies the hum of traffic and the howl of winter winds. The bottle she carried was her grandmother's last gift. A recipe of wild roots and blossoms, steeped in honey and whispered prayers. This drink, her grandmother had said, carries hope. It won't change the world, but sometimes it changes a heart. Mera didn't know if the story was true. All she knew was that it gave her strength. Each time hunger gnawed at her stomach or despair threatened her spirit, she took a sip. And somehow she kept going. That day, as she poured a few drops into the fountain before drinking, she noticed the girl approaching. Blonde hair neat, dress spotless, shoes that cost more than Mera had ever touched in her life. Everything about her screamed a world unreachable. Yet Elara's eyes weren't filled with pride. They were filled with curiosity, even kindness. She pointed at the bottle. Mera hesitated. Should she share it? This was her last vial, the last tie to her grandmother's faith. But something in Elara's gaze, a longing, a silent ache, made her heart soften. She lifted the bottle, holding it between them. This isn't just a drink, she whispered. It carries hope. It gives voice to what's trapped inside. Elara couldn't hear the words, but she understood the offering. Her small hand reached forward. Their worlds so far apart touched at the rim of that fragile bottle. The golden liquid shimmered as Elara lifted the bottle. It smelled faintly of honey, mint, and something older, almost like rain on stone. She hesitated, glancing at Mera, who gave the faintest nod. With trembling lips, Elara took a sip. The liquid slid down her throat like warmth itself. For a moment, nothing happened. The plaza bustled on. Footsteps, laughter, vendors calling out. Elara stood still, confused. Then it began. A burn spread across her throat, not painful but fierce, as though fire and light were battling inside her chest. She clutched her neck, eyes wide. Tears sprang to her eyes as her lungs tightened. Mera reached forward, alarmed. No, don't cry. It's supposed to help. Elara gasped. A sound, the faintest sound, escaped her lips. Broken, weak, but real. From across the street, Thomas had just stepped out of his building. His gaze swept the plaza, landing on his daughter. He froze, her lips moved again. And then, clear enough to shatter years of silence, came the word he had prayed for. Papa. The briefcase slipped from his hand. Papers scattered across the sidewalk as tears blinded him. He stumbled forward, running, his heart thundering louder than the city itself. Papa, Elara whispered again, voice shaking but stronger. She fell into his arms as he reached her, sobbing, clutching her as if afraid she'd vanish. And beside them, Mera stood quietly, her empty bottle glinting in the sun. For the first time in his life, Thomas Harrington, the man who bowed to no one, who commanded rooms with a glance, dropped to his knees before a child who had nothing. He held Elara close, his tears soaking her hair. But his eyes lifted to Mera. What did you do? Who are you? Mera shook her head. Nobody. Just someone who believed her voice was never gone. Thomas reached for his wallet, pulling out cash, more than Mera had ever seen in one place. Take it, please. You gave me my daughter back. You deserve. Mera stepped back, shaking her head. I didn't do it for money. I did it because no child should live without hope. Her words sliced deeper than any rejection Thomas had ever faced. For years he had thrown fortunes at his daughter's silence, believing wealth could solve anything. But here stood a girl with nothing, no home, no future, who had given him the one miracle his empire could not buy. Elara tugged his sleeve, whispering, Sister, her first word beyond Papa. Mera's eyes widened. Tears welled. In that moment, the girl who had spent her life unseen was finally named, acknowledged, loved. Days later, Mera stepped into the Harrington mansion. Its glass doors towered like cathedrals, chandeliers glowing like captured suns. Servants lined the hallways, staring at the ragged girl who clutched her torn backpack nervously. Elara ran ahead, tugging Mera's hand, her voice still fragile but growing. "Come, room, sister." Thomas watched from the staircase, heart heavy. He had insisted Mera come at least for a night. But he knew this was more than charity. This was a debt, one he could never repay. At dinner, silver trays gleamed with roasted meats, crystal glasses sparkled with wine. Mera sat stiffly, unused to knives and forks, to food that wasn't scraped from bins or bought stale. She tried to copy Elara, fumbling, embarrassed. But Elara only laughed softly, sliding her plate closer. Share, Thomas saw it. The bond already forming, unshaken by class, wealth, or shame. He realized then, Elara didn't need a cure. She needed connection, and Mera, perhaps she needed a family, but Mera carried shadows. At night, in the grand guest room, she lay awake staring at the ceiling carved with gold. She remembered her grandmother's stories, her frail body fading in the cold. She remembered nights when hunger gnawed so sharply she cried herself silent. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong anywhere. One evening, she tried to leave. Backpack slung over her shoulder, shoes quiet on the marble floor. But Elara found her at the door. Why? Elara whispered, her voice trembling but clear. Mera froze. That single word carried more than a question. It carried need, fear, love. Mera dropped the bag. She knelt, hugging Elara tightly. "Because I'm scared. Scared of being seen. Scared of losing this too." Elara shook her head fiercely. "Stay, sister." For the first time in her life, Mera felt chosen. Not pitied. Not tolerated, chosen. But the outside world wasn't so kind. News spread quickly. Millionaire's daughter speaks after miracle cure. Reporters swarmed. Whispers filled Thomas's business circles, that a street girl with a magic potion had healed his heiress. Some mocked. Some plotted. One rival investor sneered at a gala. So the great Harrington empire now relies on witchcraft? Thomas's jaw tightened, but Elara's small hand slipped into his. She spoke, her voice weak but steady. "Hope is stronger than gold." The room fell silent. Her words, fractured but fearless, carried more power than her father's billions ever had. And Mera, standing in the shadows, realized. Elara's voice wasn't just healed. It was destined, but miracles often come with storms. Weeks later, Elara collapsed during breakfast, her voice cutting mid-sentence. Panic erupted. Doctors rushed in, scanning, testing. They claimed her vocal cords had been strained, perhaps damaged. Thomas broke, raging. "This is my fault. I pushed her. I wanted too much," but Mera shook her head. "No, voices aren't muscles you buy or break. They're hearts learning to be heard." That night, Mera sat by Elara's bed, holding her hand, whispering stories her grandmother once told. Elara, though silent, smiled. She wrote in her journal, voice not gone, just resting, like stars behind clouds. Thomas stood torn. He wanted to shield his daughter from the world forever. But Mera argued gently. "You can't keep her hidden." Her voice wasn't given back to be locked away. It was given to be shared. He stared at this girl, ragged, scarred, yet wise beyond her years, and for the first time admitted, "You've taught me more than any empire ever has." Months passed. Elara's strength returned. Her voice remained soft, sometimes breaking, but she began to use it. At first to read bedtime stories with Mera, then to sing small lullabies in the garden, and finally to stand at a children's hospital, trembling but brave, speaking 3 words. "You are loved." The crowd of sick children erupted in applause, tears streaming down nurses' cheeks. Thomas wept openly. Mera squeezed Elara's hand. Her voice had become more than sound. It had become a lifeline. One snowy evening, Thomas gathered both girls by the fireplace. He looked at Mera, his voice low. "I can't replace what you lost, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be your father too." Mera's breath caught. She looked at Elara, whose eyes glistened with hope. Elara whispered, "Family." And that single word sealed it. The Harrington mansion changed. Laughter filled halls once echoing with silence. Elara's drawings decorated the walls. Mera's stories filled the rooms. Together they built a new rhythm, one of belonging, healing, and second chances. Thomas learned that true riches weren't stocks or skyscrapers. but 2 daughters curled asleep on his chest. Years later, Elara kept the bottle, empty now but shining with memory, on her bedside table. Each time she looked at it, she remembered the day her life was rewritten. She whispered softly to Mera, "It wasn't the sip that changed me. It was you." And so, a girl born into silence, a girl born into poverty, and a man born into power discovered the same truth. Hope cannot be bought, only shared. Their story became legend, not of riches, but of voices found, families chosen, and the golden sip that revealed what was always there: love. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Whisper Feel. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope, miracles, and second chances. Remember, sometimes the smallest acts, like a sip, a smile, or a handheld, can change everything.